Hey everyone, welcome back. It is September 26th, 2023, and we're in Cohort 4, Meeting 14 on our second discussion of Chapter 6. So before we jump over to the text, does anyone want to just give any thought or take on 6? Yeah, briefly, just Charles, it alternates time. So the earlier time, now we're in Cohort 4, Chapter 6, and vice versa, but it's all different angles on the same thing. So it's not like there's something that won't make sense in 6 because
That's cool. I'll just hang around and absorb what I can.
thank you.
Carry on. Thanks.
Yeah. So anyone want to give a thought on 6, or we can look at the questions that haven't been addressed yet? Okay, let's just go to a question. And then if somebody has another question, they can write in the chat or raise their hand. Okay. The authors talk about language, but in language processing, one usually assumes recursive processes, e.g. a context-free grammar. How can FEP active inference account for recursivity? In my understanding, hidden Markov models implement types of regular grammars. I assume that hierarchical extensions, i.e. section 642, does not fundamentally change this, does it? Did anyone here ask the question, or does anyone want to give a thought on this? I'm not exactly sure what the question is getting at. However, some senses of recursion can be accommodated by hierarchical modeling. So active inference models of reading have, for example, letters nested within words, words nested within sentences, and so on. So this hierarchical model embodies the sparsity associated with this kind of a recursive process. And then another kind of related notion of recursion is closer to re-entry, where something is more like self-reflexive. And so that is less referring to like the hierarchically nested, like kind of nested for loops notion, and more having to do with like re-entry of input and reference, which we might point to first off, just the fundamental re-entry of the consequences of action through perception via the niche for the agent, and then a little bit more on the sophisticated cognitive entity, the recursive identity concept and like identity re-entering in reference to itself. Ali, go for it. Yeah.
Well, perhaps the question also, I'm not sure, but maybe one angle to answer this question is to answer whether generative models are exclusively recursive models or not. So I believe in active inference framework, and especially its current formulation, there isn't any restrictions for generative models to be exclusively recursive. So they can be applied for both nested and recursive models, and also in some situations we can have purely, non-recursive or sequential models as well. It's in its current standing, it is much more broader than only a recursive kind of structure as HHMs were dealing with a couple of decades ago.
Great point, and it kind of returns to the theme of chapter 6 and the questions that are asked in chapter 6. It's like, what kind of recursive phenomena is being desired to be modeled? And then there's sort of like what you intentionally include in your model. Like, you know that you want to have this phenomena and you're going to engineer and implement motifs or mechanics to get this phenomena. Like, it's your target phenomena. You want to have a phase transition associated with people like leaving a crowded room. And then like you want to like kind of like build that into the model super explicitly. And then a little bit more indirectly would be, you want to have some phenomena arising, but you don't want that phenomena to be like explicitly a parameter in the model. But that's the chapter 6 question. What do you actually want to model? What system of interest do you want to model? And that's non-trivial to identify the boundaries of the system and to subset what you actually want to model about it and what's interesting, what questions you want to model, because otherwise you're just making a map that's the territory and there's no point in doing so. Okay. How's the active inference modeling recipe or approach to modeling similar and different from other modeling approaches? That's a very good question. Just from what people have seen or what they feel, what's one or more similarities or differences, whether people have done some quantitative modeling like statistics or systems engineering, or whether they've done some other informal analysis approach. How is or could be active inference chapter 6 recipe different? Yeah, Ali.
I think this question is, I don't know, perhaps too general to be answered sufficiently or helpfully, but when it comes to active inference modeling, my own understanding is that the main thing that sets it apart from perhaps all the other or many other approaches is its emphasis on constructing the useful and appropriate generative model. So in all the other approaches, the representation of the world or the phenomena we're trying to model is not something that it's not on very clear probabilistic representation terms, so to speak. But in active inference, there's this clear distinction between what kinds of phenomena or what maybe we can say what kind of structure the phenomena or the system we're trying to model encapsulates in terms of its probabilistic behavior. So it is much more clear than other modeling approaches when it comes to the representation of that specific system world or the phenomena of interest in relation to its generative model construction. So yeah, I think the main distinction lies exactly in the approach to constructing that representation.
Thanks. Anyone else, feel free to raise your hand or go for it. I'll also point to recent work by Mao et al. From this year, where they designing explainable artificial intelligence with active inference, a framework for transparent introspection and decision making. It points towards some of the motifs that make it different and which give it a semantic interpretability, because when features of the system, including its own introspection, its own confidence on its answers or its sense making, are framed in terms of probabilistic parameters that are just what it says on the label, then there is a clear sense of what structure or phenomena arising from structure of the system that we're modeling. That doesn't mean that the model in hand is going to be the system we're modeling. Obviously, that's the whole map territory fallacy situation. But when we have interpretable parameters that play explicit roles in semantic Bayesian networks, then at least we're on that path. Yeah, I'll bring that paper into, I'm sure it's somewhere else in here, but Charles, this is the paper of Ramstead et al. On the map territory fallacy. And just in brief, commonly people talk about map territory fallacy, which would be the fallacious equivalence of a map in a territory. People are pretty familiar with map territory fallacy. Map is not the territory, all of that, maps are useful, some are, all of that. And in this paper, they point to a kind of extreme case where people will look at active inference free energy principle modeling and say, oh, well, it's just making a map. So it's just making a map of the territory. So it's not the territory. So it's kind of like, what's the issue? Like, what's the value add? And so there's a few aspects to this, and it relates to on one side, reification of the map and the territory. Like, you go in with the map to the territory, and then like you know that the map's not the territory, yet still they are used to kind of co-justify each other. And then another flavor is, oh, well, then free energy principle does nothing if it's just helping us build maps. That's nothing. That's just a mapping framework. And that's like a fallacy on the map territory fallacy. Ollie or anyone else, what other angles are there?
I can actually just chime in quickly because
yeah.
it relates to the one or sort of two-part question comment that I did put into Coda last week, relating to chapter 1, but maybe it's another angle on the same thing, which is the modeling versus action. It's kind of a can of worms, but I don't know if that's enough of a prompt to kind of address these terms.
Yeah, how do you see it?
Well, I'm not sure. This is was one of my initial questions that came up right away. Where I guess the answer is in the definitions, but in practice, how is the modeling as action compared to modeling in contrast to action? I guess that's the best I can put it right now.
That's very interesting. Like, modeling is an action. It's an iterated process that a modeler takes. In fact, we could even do a chapter 6 on chapter 6 and make a cognitive model of somebody applying active inference to modeling. Eventually, I expect that that would be relevant. So there is a sense in which modeling is an action. It's a practice. It has explicit and implicit skills associated with it. So modeling is action. However, modeling throwing a baseball isn't throwing a baseball.
There's a tiny bit more I can add, which I see I had written also, I think in Coda, under Cohort 5. Of course, observing and documenting are both also action. However, the systems and behaviors being observed would be the primary actors in the sense of the action. Yeah, anyway, it has to do with that. Observing as action it relates to that too.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll return to these, but think about the setting of so let's just say we're chapter 6ing a baseball game. So we have a person who's a spectator. They are still taking action with their eye saccade to look at different parts of the field, reducing their uncertainty. And then covertly, internally, they are deploying attention as action, attending to different parts of their experience. So even a seemingly passive, perhaps overtly passive observer is active, at least in the attentional, covert, internal sense, if not also in the epistemic foraging, eye saccade sense, like choosing where to look. But none of that activity happening in the spectator is the action happening on the field. And then to connect this back to the map territory fallacy, no matter how deep we go into this model of like a spectator and an athlete, it does the end of the process isn't going to be like a material spectator and an athlete. The map of that setting, that cognitive setting, isn't the territory. That's so now we're immune to the map territory fallacy. Map is not the territory, but then what is it? It's a map. And then I'll also note that Ramsted's Sakdeva Devel and Friston go a little bit further than just naming their critique of this deployment. They come back even stronger and say, actually, free energy principle is the ideal model. And any model that doesn't conform to the free energy principle with respect to the map territory scenario is either saying too much or too little. Ali.
So there's this heated debate in the philosophy of mind and I don't know, the philosophy of neuroscience about the mereological fallacy, which says something to the effect that it is a fallacy to ascribe a psychological action to a part of a cognitive agent. So when we say that the brain does something, it's not actually what brain that does that specific action, but the whole agent that possess the brain is responsible for the action. So I'm not sure how, I mean, in this kind of self-referential scenario of modeling, this mereological fallacy holds or not, or whether at what point we can escape this mereological fallacy. But when it comes to map territory fallacy, my understanding is that the FEP and active inference escape this exact mereological fallacy right from the beginning by not conflating map and the territory, and or in other words, by taking a totally different approach to the concept of agency. It's not something that's just metaphorically ascribed to part of the system. So when they say that a part of a system looks as if it does some kind of inference or any action, it's not just a pure metaphor. It's built into the very fabric of active inference theory. So yeah, I believe in that case, this kind of self-referential scenario can be applied indefinitely if we wanted to, with this specific kind of approach.
Thank you, Ali. I'll see if this is kind of another piece of it. When we say a system looks as if it is bounding surprise or it's reducing surprise, that's not metaphorical or the realist claim about the territory. It's a narrow and limited claim about the map, which, and now all claims about maps, unless they're being considered in some abstract mapping setting, are on the foundation of the relationship between the map and the territory. How is it being approached differently in ActInf? We have figure 9.2, 9.1. The meta Bayesian. So here in the center, we have the cognitive model of the system of interest of the subject of the modeling subject. And then outside of the subject is this is figure and ground. So we're being explicit that we're making a map about the cognitive model of the subject. Now, that subject's cognitive model could be a map of the environment as well. But once we enter into this mode of modeling, we're not making claims about the subject. We're either making claims about our map of the subject, and then a subset of that is maps that the subject makes about the environment. I hope that didn't say too much or too little, but I think that is what it resonates in me when Ali says that we kind of head off that fallacy from the beginning, because the task that we're doing in cognitive modeling, if this is a rat in a T maze, or if this is some digital environment or something like that, is we set up our work explicitly as making a map, rather than like, well, what does the amygdala do? It's like, well, then you're going to get into a situation. It's like, are we making claims about the amygdala? Because that's a claim about the territory. But if we say, well, we're building a map of the amygdala, and one of the functionalities in our map is that the amygdala is making a map of its environment. So that's a kind of nested mapping, and that may relate to the earlier recursion question. But now if we have prevented or stymied off this map territory fallacy, which is actually fairly easy to identify if it's approached hygienically, then we're just not making claims about the amygdala directly. We're building the map, which can include submaps, but then there doesn't have to be. I mean, this is the Scylla and the Charybdis. map territory fallacy on one hand, and then the fallacy on the other hand. Because like the map's utility and relevance is related to its mapping, of course, which we want to be able to say things like, yeah, 4th Street and 5th Street run in parallel. And I'm not just talking about my map. But that's the empirical question.
I had a question about the map and territory. Could you explain more about what the fallacy is?
Yeah. I'll give a first take. Broadly, the map territory fallacy is when a constructed map, which is to say an abstraction or a model of some real material system of interest or territory, when, especially in a science or research or modeling setting, it can be easy to kind of conflate or use rhetoric from one regarding the other. So we have a bunch of healthcare data on, doing this and this health outcome. And we did a linear regression, and we found that smoking was increasing the risk of lung cancer. Sounds like a relevant thing to say. But the more narrow statistical claim would be there was a statistically significant positive regression slope between this measure and that measure. So that's on the mapping. We did a linear regression, and we want to be able to, it's like, look at the line. Don't we want to be able to say that there's like a positive relationship between these things in the real world? So that's the tension, because you'd want to be able to just, first off, look at your statistical results on the map and make a statement about the territory. Like, doing this increases that. But that's already leaving the map. It's like you're looking at the map. It's like, well, it looks like these two roads intersect at this GPS coordinate. But it's like, but that doesn't mean that they do. Especially if you're like extrapolating. So then if somebody were to have smoked twice as much, then they would have this much more. So the map territory fallacy is just, it's done in science communication. It's done in self-talk. It's done in so many different settings where something is gleaned or constructed in the map, as all maps are, and then that is used to justify, and sometimes even linguistically is woven or completely mixed into claims about the territory, which may be valid or aligned or resonant or like pointing in the same direction. So it's not like we're not in a situation where like maps are like deceptive, unless they are, but that is the tension. What can you say about the map and the territory? But it starts with just the fundamental recognition and the repeated exhortation that the map's not the territory, which is why you hear that, as well as like all models are wrong, some are useful, or the Borges story of the map maker who like makes a map that's so detailed that it covers everything, and then like it becomes the territory. Those are all kind of allegorical ways to talk about it. But the big issue is when we're doing scientific modeling, we're doing map making, and there's this complexity of relationship between any map and any territory. And again, it would be so simple and straightforward to just make the map, do the statistics, and then the statistics should just apply right back to the territory. I have GPS locations on these two objects. I made a statistical model of their location. In the statistical model, they're close. So can we say that the objects are close? It's like, just let me say that. But if it were that way, yeah, exactly. As Charles says, it's not so clean and distinct. There are settings where it is clean and distinct, but those are not every setting.
That makes sense.
And it happens a ton in neuroscience as well, because the territory is so messy and ineffable that it's like somebody will make some list of terms, or they'll make some axes that they're studying, summary statistics, or personality traits, or just somebody brings some framework to reckon or to grasp with neuroscience or with psychology, and then they start reifying the existence. It's like, I can't believe there's things in the upper left quadrant of this thing that I made. But that's, again, it's a statement about maps, not territories. Ajit or Ali, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a probably useful distinction made by Deleuze between representation and cartography. So he makes a clear distinction between what we want to represent, in other words, what we want to trace in our models, and the cartography, or the action of mapping something in the model, or diagramming, or meta-modeling, or whatever. In this sense, I think what active inference does, I mean, in light of this distinction between representation and cartography, more maps into the representation side of modeling. In other words, the very active constructing a generative model of the world, or the phenomenon of interest, is done by tracing the probabilistic states of the world. So it's not cartography in the sense of mapping or diagramming or meta modeling, but rather it actually does this very active tracing or representation. So I think it also helps to distinguish between the usual way of talking about mapping or modeling in other scientific endeavors, and the active inference way of doing things.
Would there ever be a case where you are talking about the territory? Like, I'm just kind of wondering, like, when you would ever talk about the territory in science, because wouldn't it always be sort of some representation you're working with?
What do you think? Ali?
Yeah, so it depends on what we mean by representation in relation to the territory we're trying to quote unquote represent. But I mean, even the simplest act of observing the world, and I mean, observing anything that we want to model entails at least an elementary kind of representation or cartography combined. So maybe, I mean, it's not possible theoretically and philosophically even to have a direct access to the territory we want to study, but the only way we can have anything useful to say about that specific territory is through the representation and cartography. At least this is one of the views held by structural realists, and specifically ontological structural realists. So it's not about the content of the world, but the structure of the content of that world manifests themselves that scientists are interested in. So yeah, at least in some perspectives, it's not possible to have that direct knowledge of the territory.
Judith, I think it's an excellent question. As many, we just kind of surface them, and it's for people to consider. But if we were engineers and if we were building a bridge and we had the blueprint and we were talking about the blueprint, like, is it sufficient to just make strong claims about blueprints that we have in hand on the table, and then understand that there's a relationship between the blueprints that we make and the territory that we care about? Is that enough? Like, is that like a firewalled approach where we're only going to talk about the blueprint that we have on the table, and blueprints are related to bridges? Or are there times where we want to bypass the blueprint and just say, maybe look at the bridge and say, these two things look like they're this way? And then, yeah, what do you think about this?
Yeah, like I guess there are some cases where you'd have to make sure you know that they're distinct. Especially like when you're considering the things the blueprint can't really capture about the bridge.
Yeah. And in neuro and psychology, these come up, especially like when classifying brain regions or when classifying different neurodiversities. One topic that Ollie's mention of the traces in the world, this reminded me of Bruno Latour's work on actor network theory and ants. And this is a very like proto ActInf approach. It's all about resuming the task of tracing. And it's very provocative, and another I think provocative philosophical term in this space is always already. I think, like, these are just two English words. Come on now. The perception of phenomena by the mind of an observer. The features of phenomena that seem to precede any perception of it are said to be always already present. That is very provocative, I believe, or evocative. It's like, it was already that way. So we're showing up in the stream of things, potentially resuming the tracing of associativity in a map making setting. Charles, quick context definition of blueprint and bridge. There, I was being completely exoteric. I really was talking about a civil engineering setting with people sketching out a blueprint, like an architectural grounds plan about a bridge that like cars would drive over.
So compared to the actual bridge, then.
Yeah. And then in
Got
the
it.
neuroscience setting, we have the person's body is the territory.
Okay, cool.
And then,
Got
yeah, and then the blueprint would be some chapter 5. Like, well, here's how, the elbow bone's connected to the knee bone. But the body is a complex territory, which is why so much has been written and explored on it.
Indeed. Thank you.
Yeah.
And the
Cool.
body's a bridge too, right? Sorry, go ahead.
And the body's a bridge, and the body's body as map, body as void, this as that, this already always as that. Like, that's the fun. Okay, let's go to this question from Andrew. Okay, self-talk is one of the topics or activities where map territory concerns apply. Any direct work or paper references on this topic you could share? What do people think?
And yeah, just to chime in, I mean, I just heard you say that along the way whenever we were discussing the fallacy there, and it just really piqued my interest. So, I mean, I can already imagine how that could play out as far as someone considering, you know, themselves, the cognitive process of like they're attempting to map whatever it is that's going on with them, whatever it is they're directing their attention towards, versus the territory that is an entire generative process going on that probably from an active inference framework, they're only going to be able to kind of approximate in their own model of that territory. But in any case, I just it's so I feel like I could get into an infinite regress here with just thinking of what's going on whenever I self-talk. And was curious if there was any published work here or anything along those lines.
I don't know of any published work on this. I'm sure there are analyses on like self-reported self-talk, but it's something that is understandably hard to measure in flow, and you get into all these kind of like recursive questions. What if you remembered saying it to yourself but you didn't in the moment, or you did say it in the moment but you didn't remember it or tend to it? Yeah, I mentioned it just because it is like the kind of singularity of map and territory. Like, okay, let's just say that that a cognitive activity is making maps. So just, you know, putting ourselves in the driver's seat, not figure 9.1, not behavioral researcher, but you could take that stance too. But viewed from the inside, we are making maps of our territory, you know, where objects are in the room and all these other things. And then that map re-enters through heard language and sub-vocalized language. So it is embodied action as well. Ajith?
So by self-talk, do you mean like an inner monologue? I think I might be missing some context.
Yeah. Like stream of consciousness, whether just the internal flow and imagination, or even explicit self-coaching.
I've seen a paper published where they use like fMRI data to predict what people's inner monologues are, if that might be something that could be some way of mapping out this territory. Also what people are sort of imagining visually, and also what they're listening, like what they're perceiving in terms of music, things like that. I think like the latest sort of deep learning models are actually getting sophisticated enough where they can be able to predict what people are intuiting just using like the right type of data.
Just to say that that very much is in line with the kind of thing I'd be interested in. I guess bonus points that I'm interested in neuroimaging data, especially. So I just shared. Is this?
I can send some papers that I actually
Yeah,
I'm
put them
also
in here. Just follow the little token and then add them in here.
Right.
Oh,
I just shared one just to see if I could confirm with you. Is this at all in line with what you were referring to there, Ajit?
is it on the screen? Oh yeah, that is pilot fMRI data.
Just quick Google search. I'm not trying to throw us off track here. But
This is not the one I was referring to, but I can find the one I was referring to. I think it was like recent. It was like in 2023.
Oh, that even better. All right, great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem.
Wow. Yeah, this is very, I mean, and to kind of return to chapter 6, like this is why we have a chapter 6. This is why unified approaches to perception, cognition, action matter. This is why having an active inference ontology is important. This is why having a recipe for making generative models and having some of this meta theory or meta position on the relationship of map and territory, fallacy and fallacy and fallacy cubed, because these are not just massively interactive and nonlinear systems of interest. They're also ones that we're always already experiencing. So if it was just a Rube Goldberg machine, that would be one thing. But it still wouldn't even be of the type qualitatively of, without even going too deep into phenomenology and like experience and awareness, it just wouldn't necessarily be of the type that would be a recursive re-entrant cognitive system. And this is why I think the textbook ends with these lines. Important rites of passage in theoretical neurobiology are trying to write down a generative model, experiencing the frustration when simulations misbehave, and learning from violations of your prior belief when something unexpected happens. So it's like, this isn't just a hot take. Like what can you say about some of these settings that's just like, oh, okay. It's you don't just like drop the mic and like dust off your hands in this iterated generative modeling practice. It's like, especially if we're applying it to a setting like self-talk, let's say, or some other psychological phenomena, which, you know, impinges or overlaps on self-talk, you write down the generative model. There's a recipe. It's chapter 6, plus some of the other pieces that people have added in. You write it down. You roll it out. You see what happens. Did you expect what happens? Well, if you understand ActInf and you made a simple example, you may get exactly what you expect back. Like, well, I made an oscillating pendulum. And it did exactly that. It's like, great. Well, that might be like a homework assignment for like a certain course. But if we're interested in something with more richness than like a pendulum, then when we unroll that generative model, we will be surprised. And then what do we do with surprise? Well, we know there's 2 ways to bound it. Change mind, change the world. Change your mind, learn and update, change the world, re-enter, change the generative model itself on the table. So having a structured approach, profession, ontology, methodology, toolkit, et cetera, comes into play. And chapter 6 is kind of the transition point, or like the fulcrum that the book is actually organized around. Chapters 1 through 3 get us to active inference. Context, low road, high road, to or of. Chapter 4, generative models themselves. Chapter 5, generative models in the mammalian neuroscience setting. And then pretty much as soon as we can, chapter 6, now it's us making that generative model. And even without extensive math or programming experience, we can start to address some of these questions. And then we're already in the flow of things. It can definitely feel like chapter 4 is like, well, chapters 2 and 3 can feel like wading through like every single department of learning just to get 2. And then chapter 4 can feel like getting through is like impossible / improbable. All totally makes sense in terms of their evaluation and how they're experienced. But then like we break out on the other side of 4 just from a page turner perspective. In 6, and this is like such an incredible open conversation about modeling. And these they're hard questions to talk about, but hopefully people can see that at the single entity or at the research group scale, having alignment or shared reference frames around some of these topics are make or break. Thanks, Sajith. You can add, and you just add, make little subpages or add your own question, or just just the more references and the more things people add, the better. It's awesome.
Okay, yeah, I can do that.
Thank you. One other piece I'll just add on this kind of map territory is the digital introduces a very interesting setting that's kind of like a chessboard in the sense that it's fully observable, and that these are virtualized settings where strong concordances between maps and territories can be constructed to exist. So like there can be a schema, an abstract pattern or scheme that then generates the territory in a, we know ultimately it's embodied through like thermodynamics and information, all of this. So not, but to a first approximation, the digital systems have a different map territory relationship than birds. To the inner talk point, body's eye, this just made me think like inner talk is reentrance, auditory, action, and perception. Even though it doesn't go through the ear, I assume that these imaging studies ask the question, maybe even find the result that there's like activation of auditory processing or something like that. Then we have visual, but these are so those are internalized exteroceptive processes: inner eye, inner ear, inner touch. But then like, do we have internalized interoceptive? as well? Like, can we take an inner virtual view on something that's already inner? And is that, different? Where is it more or less relevant than self-talk? But if you could take an inner position on the interpretation of the self-talk, then I think we get into Andrew's infinite regresses.
Yeah, I don't know. It just brings up so many questions for me of how to conceptualize that one, because I mean, in a certain way, if someone were to engage in self-talk, I could view it as like they're if we view the self itself as like a kind of map that the person has constructed. So you've taken your map and now you're making a map of your map, perhaps like analyzing it, or maybe you're just engaging in some kind of nested structure learning, like, oh, let me revise my model of myself. I don't know, there's so many. I think some kind of more empirical work would need something a little bit more finesse than the way I'm talking about it right now. But there are interesting ways it could go, I could imagine. I don't know.
Yeah, like the system can't, a system cannot just provide, if it just represents everything, then it's just a pass-through system. There's no attention or distillation or representation, just a straight pass-through. So whether we're talking about ourselves or some other hypothetical system, the self-representation that it explicitly makes to itself is a sample or a selection or an attention reallocation of something else. Like, that's just like kind of light and dark. Like, is it all equally lit and it's just a pass-through? Or is there going to be some area that is brought more into focus in the representation? And then, so what should be represented? Maybe that's where people have different views, obviously, but there's the preference to have our representation be amicable or like pleasant. That's clearly one drive. Another drive is for meaning, all these different things.
And I think you recall somewhere earlier in the textbook, Friston, well, the authors say something about an agent having a model of itself in order to differentiate itself from its environment, i.e. the generative process around it, and how that may be possibly an essential aspect, at least for certain entities, in maintaining something along the lines of homeostasis. That is, if you don't have a sense of what you need and what you need to do, which is part of you, then and potentially you dissipate, into the entropic processes around you. So anyway, I don't want to keep us up here, but it's interesting. Yeah,
it's fun. Yeah, as usual, another great chapter 6 journey. Chapter 6 is like an inflection point in the book and in how we approach things. So we will then, in the coming weeks, with the alternating times, head into chapter 7 and 8 on discrete and continuous time models, chapter 9 on data-based analysis, chapter 10 wrapping things up. All right. Thanks, everyone. Until next time.
yep.
Bye.